welcome you to day 251 of Humanity Rising. Our hearts today go to India. In the last 24 hours, they've set a new world record for the number of people who've died in a 24-hour period from COVID, 4,529. This exceeded the last record for the number of deaths in a 24-hour period set by the United States on January 12th of this year, when 4,783 people died. And to date, about 283,000 people in India have died of COVID. This is still a far cry from the number of people who died in the United States, which now approaches nearly 600,000. So what is happening in India right now, the consternation, the visual images, let us just send our hearts, our prayers, our love to that vast subcontinent, which is really suffering both the scourge of the pandemic, but also the scourge of government inability to provide basic health care, oxygen, or vaccines. I also want to note the turmoil in the Middle East today. For the last week, 10 days, the Middle East yet again has erupted in violence as the irresistible force of Israeli domination of that region meets the immovable object of Palestinian identity and the refusal of indigenous people there to submit to colonial oppression. And that's a region that's been in perpetual war since the Second World War, when the Jews decided, given what had happened to them under the Nazis in Europe, to shift their identity and their place of home to the Middle East, and found living there a people that up until the present day refuse to surrender their sovereignty. So whether it's in India, whether it's in the Middle East, we're seeing tumult, we're seeing suffering, we're seeing an almost unbelievable unwillingness to share and to include. And that's a major topic that we're going to delve into today, this question of identity. Let us begin, as we always do, by just taking a moment, taking a few deep breaths, closing our eyes and placing our attention on our hearts. And for just a minute, listen to your heartbeat in a spirit of thanksgiving and gratitude that we're alive. And if you can, focus your attention through your heartbeat on someone or something that you deeply love, and feel that resonance. Thank you, everyone. And now, with an open heart and a heart full of gratitude and love for each and every one of you who are joining our session today, I want to commence our program by reflecting for just a moment on identity. We all have multifaceted identities. And over the last 15 months of the pandemic, there's perhaps been no icon of identity more powerful than the death of George Floyd on May 25th, 2020, as he suffocated under the knee to his neck of a white police officer. And that exploded into the global public consciousness, the issue of race, the issue of ethnicity, the issue of how we identify ourselves in relationship to difference. Another issue of identity that has been bubbling up for some time and over the last year has just reached almost a crescendo is the identity around gender, around sexuality. For thousands of years, men were men and women were women, and that was just the way it was. And in the last generation or so, there's been not only the explosion of women's liberation as a whole new identity for women, but there's been an explosion in gender fluidity that is causing all of us to question very deeply who we are in terms of our maleness and our femaleness that abides in all of us, and our genders in relationship to our sexuality. So today we want to explore the intersectionality between gender and sexuality and race and ethnicity, because all of that is bubbling up simultaneously, demanding not only public attention, but personal attention as we navigate a planet now of 7 billion people around the world. So I'm delighted to be able to turn our program over to our Next Gen group that's been convened by Matt Robertson and Raji Jayasinghe and Veronica Salidas, who are staff at Ubiquity University and are actively engaged in many issues, but have been the driving force to our Next Gen group that has appeared consistently through the months of Humanity Rising. So Matt, Raji, Veronica, I want to welcome you, and I turn the program over to Matt.
Thanks so much, Jim. My name is Matt Robertson. I'm part of the Next Gen team here at Ubiquity University, and we're excited to be back. It's been a little while since the Next Gen team has hosted a session, and we couldn't be more thrilled to reconvene our group alongside a number of global scholars, practitioners, and activists on the topic of shape-shifting and identity. And we'll have a dialogue, as Jim mentioned, at the intersection of race, ethnicity, gender, and sexuality. And our Next Gen team would like to say just a few words on the topic before we dive in with our panelists. We tend to read our mission statement at the beginning, but because we have such a full program today, I will put those links to our group and all of the things that we're doing in the chat. As we move through the presentation, if you have questions for our presenters, please do put them in the chat, and we've reserved some time at the end to make sure that we can relay those questions to them about their various work in the world. And I'd like to start off by talking just a bit about my own interest and passion in this subject. I think the question of identity and how it changes throughout our lives is really a core fundamental question and framework that affects the very core of our experience as human beings. And by extension, really colors not only our day-to-day experience and perception of ourselves, but the world around us and our relationships with other people, which in an unprecedented way has transformed and changed, especially in the last year and a half, probably more than any other time in history. We have the forces of technological interconnection. We have the alternate force of needing to quarantine and no longer be connected because of COVID. And this is affecting us in really interesting, new and profound ways. We tend to think of ourselves as individuals as static. I'm Matt Robertson. I move through my life and things kind of happen to me. And I'm defined by my external circumstances on one hand, but also in a more internal way by my ego, my personality, my sense of self. And we tend to think of ourselves as a static person, a real thing. But in reality, we do have multiple identities. In the tradition that I practice, we even say that there's 5 distinct egos or identities that are all vying for our attention as we move through our life, representative of different survival needs of different aspects of the body. So not only do we have this force within us of this relationship between internal, external, and changing through time, but we live in a world that we're not even able to rely on the social wisdom and identity of the world that has come before us. We're charting new waters. And because of that, our identity is being forced to change whether we like it or not, whether we're ready for it or not. And so the more that we take a conscious engagement with this idea of fluid identities, shape shifting through these different aspects of ourselves, the better we're going to be able to deal with the challenges that are in front of us on one hand, but even beyond that, really embrace the actual truth and potential of who we are as individuals. And this takes a lot of courage. On one hand, it's an exciting process to learn new things about ourselves, to change who we are and move through life in ways that we didn't think before was possible. And it's also a deeply challenging experience that requires the deepest aspect of our courage as human beings, because identity is something that is not thought of as fluid in many areas. It's something that is a contentious topic in so many different realms of human activity and politics. And so I'm really excited to hear today from 4 presenters who are working on these frameworks of personal, collective identity, activism and growth, healing and transformation that will help us engage more consciously with this idea of shape-shifting identity. And to start us off, we're going to hear a few thoughts from our Next Gen team. I'd like to welcome now Raji Jayasinghe to the stage, who is our VP in Asia, works a lot with our soft skills courses in Sri Lanka. And Raji, we're excited to hear from you today on your thoughts on shape-shifting and identity. Thanks so much, Raji.
Thanks, Matt. Hello, everyone, wherever you are listening in from. It's wonderful to be here and wonderful to be able to share with you today. As I reflected on this topic before today, as a Sri Lankan, which is where I'm calling in from, which is where I was born and raised, whenever the question of identity is brought to the table, the first thing that springs into any Sri Lankan's mind is ethnic identity, simply because, from the early 1980s all the way up to 2010-ish, Sri Lanka went through a very, very serious civil war, a very destructive civil war, which was based on identity, based on the Tamil majority as the singular majority versus the Tamil minority. And so that conflict has really defined all the generations from the 1970s all the way up to now. And as I reflected on this topic a little bit more, I realized that not only is our identity, well, our identity has been shaped by ethnicity over these years, but I think that with the different generations, that is starting to change. And so the question I'd like to kind of put out there into the ether for this discussion is how we can smoothen that transition. Just to be a little more specific for a minute or two, Sri Lanka in the 1980s probably went through some of the most horrific years in terms of the conflict. And so there were many people in that generation that actually fled the country. They went to live in Canada, they went to live in the UK or wherever else they were taken in because they simply couldn't live in Sri Lanka. Then you have my generation that sort of had their formative years in the 90s, a generation of people that certainly experienced the conflict. I remember bombs going off in the city and in our schools and so on. But at the same time, I would argue that I have one foot out the door. So maybe I'm in the middle of that transition somehow. And then I notice youth today that I work with who haven't lived through the conflict at all. And therefore their identity isn't so strongly tied to the ethnic issue. Their identity moving forward may be tied to other issues of the day like climate or gender or other issues. And so not to go on too long, but the question I kind of want to put out there is how do we shapeshift our identities so that we honor the past, but at the same time don't get dragged back by it? How do we move forward towards focusing on issues of the present day without disrespecting the things that have gone on in the past? How do we smoothen that transition? How do we change our mindset, whichever generation we belong to, so that our behaviors will also change and so that society in Sri Lanka moves forward to a more constructive collective identity? I think I'll leave it at that and hand back over to you, Matt.
Thanks so much, Raji. Definitely important questions that I think will shape our conversation here moving forward. And at this point, we'd like to call up Vero Saldias to the stage. We're super excited to have you. Vero is an industrial engineer, a registrar at Ubiquity University, and a member of the Next Gen team as well. So thanks for joining us, Vero, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts on the topic.
Thank you so much, Matt. Hello, everyone. Well, my name is Veronica Saldias, and as Matt says, I am part of the Next Gen team. I am an industrial engineer and an artist. And I am so happy to be here and to talk about such an important topic as this with all of you. Well, the definition of identity is who you are, is the way you think about yourself, the way you are viewed by the world, and the characteristics that define you. I think that there is a moment when we all wonder who I am, what defines me, what are my values. And although these questions are universal, many of us have accepted as answers what comes from outside, such as the society where we live, the culture and traditions of our country, religions, or any other person outside ourselves. And as a result of this, we have come to feel lost and disconnected, vulnerable and alone. And this is obvious, as I believe that each being on this planet has a purpose. I like to think that the universe is constantly creating a symphony in which we are all part of the orchestra. And it's like we are an instrument. And if maybe I am a trumpet, for example, but the outside has shaped me like a violin, I will never be able to flow with the melody of the universe. In my country, Bolivia, I am Bolivian. For many generations, people have formed their identity through social classes, skin color, and the features of their faces, gender only as a man and woman, where the man rules and the woman obeys. And in Bolivia, the 62% of the population is indigenous, and the dominant social class was made up of people who lacked these indigenous traits. So this has created generations of Bolivians with self-esteem problems for denying their roots or feeling that those roots could harm their prestige. Clearly, in the past, society in Bolivia was extremely based on the what are people going to say, and only hanging out with people of the same social class. But I should mention that this is something that is slowly evolving. It is the younger generation that are beginning to break this division a bit. There are also other two aspects in which I still feel that there is a kind of internal and collective battle. In Bolivia, there are still many women who, just because they are women, feel that they cannot be themselves, love as they want to, or love to whoever they want to, decide on their careers or decide on their motherhood. So, and also, uh, here we have so many men that just because they are men had to adopt this identity of being all like macho, and if of not being vulnerable, of not of they feel that they have to be dominant or completely hiding and suppressing their emotions, and of course like only loving women. And also here are so many people who do not identify as male or female, or cannot take that identity along with all the obligations that it entails. And for these people, there was no space, no support, no safe place where they could be who they are. Even with their families, there was no place where to explore and to ask questions. In my personal history, I am the second generation of my family that has the opportunity of living in the city. Because my grandparents are indigenous and live in the rural area of Bolivia. And I feel that my indigenous roots have been part of my identity, but I have been fortunate to learn how to be proud of them, and to make personal decisions about what this means to me and about what society here says about being or identifying as a woman. I thought that this was something from the past, but I realized that in my healing processes that I had a lot of fears and blocks ingrained within that didn't allow me to be who I am. And most of them had to do with my rejection of the identity of women here in Bolivia, just because I had seen all women around me submit and take on an identity in which they had no power, not even over themselves. And this is something I am still working on. And what is going on in my country and in the rest of the world? Well, people are starting to rebel. First, against all the stiff structure within themselves, then with their families, and then out in the world. I am perceiving the change in my family, in my friends, and others, and what this soft but persistent voice of freedom feels like. Because in the end, forming of our own identity is not about erasing everything, forgetting everything, or denying or rejecting everything that has been established. I think that it is about evolving and having the freedom to make decisions about how we feel about all of that within ourselves, and then do the changes we need to do. It is about providing a new safe space everywhere and for all beings on our planet so that they can explore, ask questions, lose themselves, deconstruct, and rebuild who they truly are. And the world right now, in these times of changes and of catharsis, needs more than ever, real people who truly love and accept each other and who can just follow their purpose. So I feel really a true happiness to start this conversation with all of you because it's time to begin the transformation. Thank you, Matt. Back to you.
Thanks so much, Vero. I have to say, through time, my conversations with you about these topics and beyond, I've always felt like I've been in a safe place with you to have critical conversations. And that's such an important aspect, I think, as you mentioned. So just want to honor who you are and your open-heartedness and compassion. And a few of the themes that I took out that I see emerging from this conversation relate to the kind of dichotomy of fear and authenticity. As the world's changing and we're kind of compelled to work with this idea of who we are and how are we changing and who do we want to be, that can be a scary pursuit. And so coming together, even in this way, through conversations like we're having today with open-heartedness, compassion for each other, that we're all on this journey, I think is a core principle for moving forward in a way that will able to allow us to explore this in depth. So thank you for sharing. And we're really excited now to call in our global presenters. We're starting with Miss Anika Abrahams out of South Africa. And Anika is an intersectional feminist. She holds an honors bachelor's degree in psychology, gender studies, and sociology from the University of the Western Cape, and is currently pursuing a master's degree in research with the Gender Studies Department that integrates aspects of psychology into her research in order to holistically understand the experiences of people of color in the contemporary world. Her presentation is entitled Die Manskap, the intersections of masculinity, class, and colored identities among young men in Cape Town. So thanks so much for being with us, Miss Anika, and the floor is yours.
Hi, everybody. I hope everybody can hear me. As Matt said, my name is Anika Abrahams, and I am a master's student at the University of Western Cape in South Africa. So my title of my thesis or my work is still a work in progress. It's actually called Die Manskap. So it's South African slang, and I will be using it throughout my presentation. If it is unclear, please let me know so that I can explain the meaning behind these words. And I chose these particular words because of what they represent to the group of people that I will be speaking about. All right. Okay, so my study is partly about resistance. For those of you who are unaware of the history of South Africa and the implications of the apartheid system and the way they used race during that time, allow me to shed some light on this. So we were categorized according to the color of our skin, the texture of our hair, the width of our nose. These phenotypical features acted as a catalyst for our humanity. It decided what we deserved, how we should be educated, where we should live, and which parts of stolen land was theirs and did not belong to us. So the war zone that was apartheid that continues to haunt the people of South Africa is similar to the actual war that's happening in Palestine. The world wasn't silent then, and I hope it's not silent now. But I digress. The horrors unleashed by the apartheid government was incomprehensible, as my country and our people are still reeling from the effects. I won't be speaking from a position of authority or claim that colored identities and experiences are homogeneous. However, I will be presenting the lived experiences of a group of young men who identify as colored. But let me provide some context on what exactly colored means to these people, to these young men in particular. I identify as a colored woman in South Africa. So colored people mostly reside in the Western Cape in South Africa. Many of us call home the Cape Flats. As you can see, the pictures on my slide are some of the photos of the Cape Flats. So the place we call home is riddled with gangsterism, drugs, and violence. It's not as scenic as other parts of Cape Town. Our environment has become synonyms for coloredness, or what it means to be a colored individual. I don't represent the number, but I know men so do. Now that you understand our resistance, colored was used as a mismatched placeholder. When someone asked what it meant to be colored, our linguistic articulation is complex, as some of us don't have the vocabulary to explore this. When we talk about taking up space as colored individuals in academia, as professionals, as artists, as doctors or teachers, we are often reminded to leave our coloredness at the door. That if I use words like awe or koppel in a sentence, somehow it's less comprehensible. Somehow it's less presentable. Somehow it's less intellectual. As if my comprehension of the oppressor's language defines my intellectual abilities. I am what my ancestors have been waiting for. I am colored excellence. I will not present a formal study to appease those who seek conformity. Today, I will speak on narratives that my participants have entrusted to me. So just a background of my study. The primary aim is to explore what it means to be a young colored man in South Africa. It does draw on an intersectional lens that positions these individuals as race, gendered, and classed individuals. All right, so let's talk about coloredness, right? So identities are social constructions, so which means it is fluid and interchangeable, and we can pick and choose which aspects we take up. Because we are in the contemporary, the colored identity has changed over time. And given the space which I have for these young men, they have decided which parts of coloredness they would like to take in, which part of coloredness they would like to represent and get rid of. Right. So as they are young men who identify with heterosexuality, hegemonic masculinity was a dominant theme throughout my study. And as we've come to know that gender is fluid and it's a performance. So these young men perform hegemonic masculinity to an extent and delve into aspects of alternative masculinity. So the overall aim of my study is to find out what it means to be a colored young man. Okay. So one of the experiences we spoke about, one of the experiences they found really important to represent was their expectations for themselves. So as you can see, these are different narratives of some of the boys or men, because some of them are older than 18. In my study, these are all different narratives of my participants. So masculine behavior of colored men are socially and academically characterized by performances of inescapable stereotypes of violence and gangsterism and substance abuse. However, the masculinities performed by these young men contradict racial stereotypes of colored men, but in turn, they do reinforce hegemonic masculinities as appropriate male behavior. In some ways, these young men contradict the principles of traditional masculinity by having a positive orientation towards their schooling and academia. A number of these boys are in forms of higher education in the universities in South Africa. The boys that are in high school all aspire to be doctors, particularly in the biomedical field. Right. So as young colored men, are unable to perform idealized masculinity, because hegemonic masculinity means one of the characteristics is being white. They are unable to do so as they are men of color. So they do find alternative versions of this, and their alternative version is being doing well in school, being a good academic, for example. As I mentioned before, they do delve into aspects of alternative masculinity. So the dominant narrative that came up in my analysis is the position of the provider. So the provider position associated to the male bodies in my study was a driving force. A common characteristics of hegemonic masculinity that is linked to male bodies. It speaks to the notions of men being responsible for providing for their families, which demands a secure and stable, a secure and legal, form of income that will ensure that the necessities are secured. The idea and foreseen weight of being a provider for these young men was very stressful and was associated with a lot of responsibility. Right, and here's another dominant theme, in my study, which was the colored identity and how these boys presented coloredness to the world. So these young men learned the dimensions of coloredness through social schooling that allowed them to take up space. It created a worldview that enabled them to identify what being colored was to them, as well as the stereotypes that shaped their identity. The conversations these young men had highlighted the way they would identify what coloredness was. They spoke about the way colored people walk, the way we talk, the way we dress. The type of linguistic dimension in colored communities vary, as the language itself is complex and taking root in several other languages and has continued to change and diversify with each generation. When we began discussing aspects of identity, these young men were eager to negate the dominant perceptions of colored people that was socially created. They've associated coloredness and they have reconstructed the narrative of coloredness and associated it with a sense of pride and accomplishment. They have shaped the colored identity along the dimensions of, So they've taken what people have considered uncivilized and uncultured and reshaped it and taken pride in this identity and embraced, for example, the different way we use language, the different way we incorporate language, the way we walk. One of these boys spoke about rolling, which is a type of walk you do in Cape Town. It's just, we just do it. There's no significance behind it. All right, and that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Anika. So many interesting questions there. And your presentation made me think more about how even a specific group, in your case, colored men in Cape Town, still struggle with so many different aspects of their identity. Even back home, as I mentioned, as this new generation kind of takes precedence over others, I think about even masculinity in Sri Lanka, which has been quite toxic in the past, but I do see the new generation speaking up to help men in Sri Lankan society shed some of the toxic masculinity that still pervades our society and embrace more of the positive aspects. Thank you, Anika. And I think we'll move on to our next speaker now, who is a practitioner in this space. And if you just give me 1 second, I will tell you a little bit about Tariq. Tariq is a sexual and bodily rights activist from Lebanon, advocating for the rights and protections of LGBT communities in the MENA region as the executive director of HELEM, which is the first LGBT rights organization in the Arab world. Tariq is an Ashoka Foundation Global Changemaker Fellow, a Ford Foundation Global Fellow, and an Eli Fellow for the Harvard Center for Public Leadership. He's a specialist in international human rights law and advocacy, adaptive leadership, public policy, and strategic communications and planning. I think I'll leave it at that. Tariq, if I've left something out, please do fill everyone in. But I would like to hand over to you now and give you the stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Raji, and thank you everybody for inviting me into this space. It's really an honor. I'm, in a completely different time zone right now, but it's very heartwarming to see such a space where we can all get together and talk about these important topics. And I want to continue the theme of identity, and I'm very grateful for my colleague who preceded me of opening up this subject and of doing it so well, because she's made a lot of what I have to say a lot easier. As an LGBTQ rights activist, identity, and my identity as a queer person or as an LGBTQ person or as a gay man, you name it, has really, really been important and has been, highly central to my own realization of self. And not only is it just about me, but it's also about an entire community that I work with and for on a daily basis. Identity has been, very much so a central rallying principle through which a lot of political work is done and channeled when it comes to LGBTQ rights all over the world. It's not just in the global south, but also in the global north, when many of these sort of quote unquote political movements started, the most famous of which would be the Stonewall riots in the 70s that, many say gave birth to the modern LGBTQ rights movement. And identity has always coalesced around civil and political rights, as we see on a daily basis of many people, whether it's their ethnic identity, sectarian identity, whatever, you name it, are central rallying calls through which a lot of activism is done. And not only is it just the work on the ground, but the entire planet seems to have evolved and adopted based on this idea of identity as a central rallying figure. So you've got entire institutions and movements and strategies and understanding of what constitutes change and impact on the ground that coalesces around the idea of identity. You've got global structures, funding, support, media that all follow this model. And that's really interesting to think, because even if you are queer, LGBTQ, and there's multiple, that's a huge acronym, quite fondly sometimes referred to as the alphabet mafia, of an ever-increasing number of letters and within this LGBTQ/queer identity. And so in itself, it is a very diverse and a very sort of multifaceted group of people, but it's still somehow under the greater umbrella term of queer is still a singular identity based on sexuality, gender identity, sexual characteristics, and gender expression. But as my colleague preceded and said, is there such a thing as a singular identity? And if there isn't, then why so much of our work and our lives and our strategies and the way we think about the world and what constitutes change is so connected to this idea of a singular identity? There's this great Bob Dylan song called I Contain Multitudes. And it is a very sort of a cool artistic introduction to what it means to be multiple people at the same time, and how all of that is you rather than multiple yous fighting for space. And as my colleague said, identity does indeed naturally change and evolve over time. I think Jim, in the beginning of his introduction, talked about gender fluidity, but there's also sexual fluidity and body fluidity. And, this is something that as barriers to this sort of identification and self-exploration are lowered, more and more of it is coming to the forefront. However, my particular experience has been with the changing of identity, not necessarily with time, but with situation and location, particularly of what facet of an identity chooses to emerge at what time. And one of the folks that wrote most eloquently about this topic is a French author and philosopher called Amin Maalouf, who wrote a book called Les Identités Meurtrières, which is in English translates to murderous identities or identities that kill. And despite the very bleak title, the central idea of the work was that whatever facet of your identity in whatever place in the world you are is most under attack, that is the one that often emerges to the forefront. So if you are, for example, a person of Middle Eastern descent and you find yourself in, let's say, early 2000s America or North America, that facet of your identity, which comes under a lot of stress, is the one that emerges forward. Or whether if you're a Lebanese person living in Lebanon, but you're queer, and there is a great deal of institutionalized homophobia and transphobia, then your queer identity is the one that comes to the forefront and therefore affects so many of your daily choices, including your political and professional choices. And the LGBTQ rights movement, historically has been very much tied to identity. And of course, it makes a lot of sense that it does, particularly when you're talking about gender identity, that a lot of trans individuals and a lot of people take incredibly seriously. But you also have a lot of queer individuals that play around with identity, such as drag performers or artists. But regardless, it has been incredibly important and a central, rallying force. In the global South, we've been able to, and largely inspired and largely constantly juxtaposing our work with work that has already been done on LGBTQ rights. Identity was, very, very important. And it was assumed to be the only way to go forward when you're talking about civil and political rights in order to achieve queer liberation for all. That was until we hit a wall. And that was until there had become really increasingly diminishing rate of return on all of the investment that you're doing and trying to do your work as an LGBTQ activist and trying to do legislative change and policy change and try to remove laws and all of that, and wondering why, despite our best efforts, we weren't really getting anywhere. And that was until the Lebanese revolution of October 2019 happened. And that revolution happened because the amount of corruption and economic devastation within Lebanon had reached unprecedented levels, to which the entire population went down in protest onto the streets and for months. And women and queer people were very interestingly at the forefront of these protests. More interestingly is that there was not a single rainbow flag in sight, and there was not a single sign that said decriminalize this or queer rights there or all of that. What it was that people were saying, we want jobs, we want adequate housing, we want an end to corruption, we want education, we want healthcare. And that was incredibly influential in the way we shifted tactics. And our central rallying cry became, for example, if you're talking about labor rights, not what can the labor rights movement do for queer people, but what can queer people do to the labor rights movement for everybody. And we have been working through that lens for, strategically and through programming for the past 3 years. And the amount and the unprecedented amount of change and quote unquote infiltration that queer people have done in spaces that we have been historically and purposefully denied for decades has been astounding. And the lens of economic and social rights, quite ironically, became sort of the window through which you could talk about civil and political rights in spaces that you were unable to access before. And that sort of started having me think about, what are the limitations of identity? And if it's something that's important, how can it coexist with other forms of work without necessarily having to sacrifice either? And I also noticed that the experience in Lebanon wasn't unique. Queer people have been at the forefront of revolutions. And 2020 was a year that was very ripe for revolutions around the world. But we noticed queer people were at the forefront in the protests in Colombia, in Peru, in Myanmar right now, in Tunisia, and in many other places. And Every single place, it's the same. People are not asking necessarily queer rights. People are saying we are queer people rallying around the rights of everyone. And the really big lesson here that is learned is that the word intersectionality is sometimes used as a buzzword. It's sometimes used as something that, you know, attempts to rally people around, you know, multiple causes and to ensure that not one cause is sacrificed for another. What people don't really realize is that intersectionality is a massive responsibility. Diversity is a responsibility. It is an incredibly difficult thing. It's not something to be taken for granted or lightly. When you talk about creating spaces where public spaces, non-commercial spaces where none existed before, and you're bringing in people, for example, that have their queer identity, and particularly a queer identity under siege, in which it is incredibly prominent. They're not just coming in with a queer identity. As Audre Lorde said, we cannot be single issue people because we do not lead single issue lives. You're coming in with people that they may all be queer, but they've got radically different ethnic identities, sectarian identities, political identities, class, able, you name it. And you're all putting them in one place and you're asking them to mobilize. And unless you build holding environments, unless you build spaces that are strong and supple enough to handle all of that diversity, then work on intersectionality can never happen. The thing I will leave you with as sort of a a conclusion that I've reached is that doing this sort of work, even though it has become a lot more possible and a lot more achievable in places in the global south that are, still reeling from the effects of colonialism and are still reeling from decolonizing their own, ways of thinking about emancipation and freedom and liberation, is that the importance of these spaces lie in how you actually create them and how you manage them. The two things that I would say is that safe spaces are incredibly important, but we must remember that adults need to learn, and sometimes tension is required for adults to learn. And I'm not talking about artificially created tension. I'm not talking about surfacing the tension that exists when you put people of multiple identities in a space together. And creating a place that allows for incredibly open and honest and safe explorations of these identities that are outside of the central rallying identity that got those butts into the seats in the first place, is where the real work happens, and where the work that has actually led to spectacular results in integrating queer people into existing social and economic and even civil and political rights that are ubiquitous across the entire country has been allowed to happen. So maybe I'll stop there, and I look forward to any questions later on in the discussion.
Thank you so much, Tariq. Thank you for your words, as well as the work that you're doing where you are. It's incredibly important work, and I know it takes a lot of determination and courage actually to do what you do. So thank you for that. I was particularly sort of touched, or I the insight of yours, which when you stated that, we have multiple identities, but the one that's under attack is the one that emerges most strongly. And I think that that's very true. And I guess the logic from that is if we attack each other less and judge each other less, then we can embrace all of our identities in a positive way. And I think that's what you're doing with the spaces that you're creating, is you're bringing people together on something that they can unite on, and that allows them to then surface the other tensions that lie beneath. So thank you so much for that. It's I really relate to what you said. Matt, I think I'll hand over to you now for the, actually, no, I think we've got Judith next. So I will actually introduce the next panelist, who is Judith Anderson. She's a Jungian psychotherapist with a background in mental health. She has also trained in and taught the integration of energy medicine techniques into psychotherapy. The combined climate change, biodiversity, and environmental crisis has been a focus for over 15 years. And now she's the chairman of the Climate Psychology Alliance, which was formed over 9 years ago. Her presentation, entitled Radical Shape-Shifting Identities and the Climate Crisis, will address the changes we are called to make in the ways we live our lives practically, psychologically, and spiritually, giving grounded reasons for each of these. So with that introduction, I would like now to hand over to you, Judith. The floor is yours.
Thank you. And thank you so much for inviting me. I feel very privileged to be here when there's a next-gen presentation, and thank you for welcoming a grandmother. So I'm going to share my screen now, and let's see where we go. And that's just takes a bit of time, and there we go. So, so my title is Radical Shape-Shifting Identities and the Climate Crisis. And I was very challenged yesterday when I heard John Kerry, the US climate envoy, tell people that they would not have to give up their quality of life to address climate change. And I think the subtext of what he was saying was that they would not have to give up their identities. And the triple whammy of the biodiversity, environmental, and climate crises does affect us. It is a culture crisis, and it's only by shape-shifting our identities that we'll be able to rise to this challenge. So in speaking to you today, I'm weaving together with gratitude insights from many colleagues and friends within the Climate Psychology Alliance with whom I've worked for a long time. I'll be referring to the work that reconnects by Joanna Macy and her work together with Chris Johnson called Active Hope. I'll be referring to deep adaptation. There'll be some personal insights that I'll weave in as well, and very much more. And I will very much try and keep to time as well. So I think we have to shapeshift into our essential nature. We have to deeply know who we are. And that includes knowing that we are animal. We are actually part of nature. We're not separate from it. I also talk a lot with people about how we can find our purpose when we're facing all these crises. Because although it's an emergency, it's a long emergency. And so we have to find a way of finding our unique task to face these horrendous problems. I don't think we should go on adopting the identities of superheroes or superheroines because they inevitably burn out. Sometimes we might put on a superhero or heroine cloak for a little while, though I think I'd prefer the archetype here of the warrior or warrioress. But basically, the adrenaline that's required for these burns us out very, very quickly. And so I'd like to address the issue for you of finding a way of shape-shifting into easeful purpose. We talk about living sustainably, but sometimes when we're activists in this field, we do it anything but sustainably. I'm having to go over these issues very briefly, but I hope these headlines will help you. I think we have to shapeshift in our emotions, and particularly from eco-anxiety to eco-empathy. We must allow all our emotions, the grief, the anger, the despair, recognizing that we feel all these things because we care. it's really important not to get stuck in one emotion and to recognize why one particular emotion might feel more familiar, feel more vital. Sometimes we feel that our activism will be fueled if we get angry enough. But in the long term, that doesn't work. And so sometimes what I talk about is, we talk about biodiversity in other contexts, but I like to think about a biodiversity of allowing all our emotions in response to the environmental and climate crises. And not to forget to dance. Staying with shape-shifting our emotions, I'd like to draw on the work of Joanna Macy. And in her work that reconnects, she takes people through a process which begins with gratitude. Gratitude for what we have. And that involves presence. We have to be really present to be able to be grateful. And then finding grief, that place in ourselves where our hearts feel broken by what we see. She asks the question, what makes and breaks your heart? And I'd like to segue here somewhat, because quite often when we think about eco-grief, we can very easily think about those singular griefs, the loss of a grandparent, for example, or the loss of a friend. And I think the challenge that the climate crisis brings us is that very often we're living with repeated griefs. On a human scale, it might be like living in a family where there's a genetic form of cancer. Perhaps a grandmother has died, and then our auntie gets a form of cancer, and then perhaps mother too, perhaps a sister. And so we're having to navigate grief. We're having to allow grief to inhabit us and inhabit grief. And I think that's very much what many people who are working in this field feel. So back to Joanna Macy. Through contact with our gratitude and really allowing ourselves to feel the grief, we then see with new eyes. We see what the task ahead is, and we can take action. Not that action solves the problem. Very often there are simplistic people who will say to me, oh, well, can you stop us being depressed about climate change if we take action? And it really isn't as simple as that. But there's no doubt that some action that we take helps us find hope, a kind of very grounded hope. And this is what I would say to John Kerry and other people, that there is a shape-shifting in our identities from consumerism to simplicity. So much of our, particularly in the West, our identity is tied up with consumerism. And I think we have to challenge growth economics. I'm delighted that Ubiquity University is having Kate Roth talk about donut economics. There's a shape-shifting in our identities to go against the grain and to actually find energy for our lives in simplicity and to find focus and space for what life calls us to through that simplicity. There's also a way in which I think we need to shapeshift into deep integrity. The strapline of the Climate Psychology Alliance is facing difficult truths. And I think finding a way of a very deep integrity in our personal lives, in our professional lives, and in what's called for in relation to planetary crisis is massively important. And I think particularly the racial injustice aspect of the planetary problem we're facing. We need to speak truth to power with compassion, of course, And I think for those of us in the West, many of us have to divest ourselves of our white privilege identity. Finally, I think we have to shape-shift the questions we ask. And I'm drawing here from Jem Bendel, who writes about deep adaptation and how we can face the possibility of collapse coming. Now, that isn't negative because collapse is not one singular thing. We can see a kind of social collapse happening right now in India. We can see it in other areas of the world of extreme poverty and the challenges that climate change brings in terms of drought and flood. And he suggests we ask these questions, which he calls the 4 R's. Questions about resilience. What is it we most value and how can we keep that? Relinquishment. What do we need to give up? Restoration. What do we need to bring back that has been lost? And perhaps above all, reconciliation. What can we do to make peace with, love, and support others? And how can we live with love, joy, and peace? And perhaps in this context today, how can we reconcile with shifting identities within ourselves and with others? So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Judith. What a wonderful presentation. We're so excited that you joined our Next Gen team here. And what a beautiful, grounded, clear presentation. There's so much that I responded to in the course of your remarks, but one of them was the power of Joanna Macy's work in my own life. I remember having an experience with her at Esalen where, as part of her work that reconnects, she led us through a simple exercise where we went out into nature and closed our eyes and took a few deep breaths. And one of the questions that, statements that she asked us to pose to ourselves was, and now open your eyes and look in the mirror. As you open your eyes and you take in the world around us, look at it as if you're looking in the mirror. Really work to shape-shift your identity towards that interconnection with all of life. And that was a pretty foundational experience for me that led me on my own journey. I'd have to say a second thing is this, in relation to that, the heroes and heroines burnout. You know, when you do start making these shifts in identity, for me, you know, there's an impulse, a desire, a genuine, burning passion to want to help everyone and do everything. And we've talked about this in the chat a little bit, that I don't need to do everything. I don't need to have my hands in all of the different pockets. I can be authentically myself, learn to come back to who I am in this incarnation and be authentically joyful in my contribution to this whole process. And for me, that's a big relationship to the energy of the divine feminine and learning how to connect with the universal, but also stay grounded in the wisdom of life in the present moment. And I think a big question that a lot of us ask ourselves is, so how do we do this on a daily basis? You know, this is great to talk about. And the four R's and the 4 questions are just a fantastic framework to contemplate on a day-to-day basis and really sit with and see what the wisdom of the body and the intelligence that we have within us has as an answer. So thank you again for your presentation. And at this point, we'll move on to our final presenter. Our final presenter is a healer, a womb alchemist, a mystic trauma therapist, and plant medicine integration practitioner. She's the founder of Kimia Healing, which supports radical transformations of chronic trauma and medical conditions. Clients describe her as a cosmic pioneer, a healer with immense ability, and a gift from the universe. Her presentation is entitled Shape-Shifting and Healing Alchemy, and will address the transmutation of density to light through the embodiment of ever deeper stillness. For example, the 0 point void, and the mastering of movement of inner energetics through multiple dimensions. Safa Boga, thank you so much for joining us today, and over to you for your presentation.
Thank you so much, Matt. It's kind of strange to hear yourself introduced, but thank you all so much for, firstly, for allowing me to be here. Speaking of identity, I would never have imagined, even recently, that I would be invited to speak about something like shapeshifting and how it pertains to the practice of energy medicine and energy alchemy. So I'm sharing experiences from my actual work in the field of healing alchemy. And going last has actually been amazing because I've absorbed so much of what these amazing speakers have been talking about. And I just want to recap some threads, some words that just came through really powerfully. And it's amazing because it kind of leads directly into what I'm going to talk about, which is shape-shifting and how that relates to the creation and recreation of our identity. So some of the words that came through really strongly for me were flow, identity, integrity, self, safety, animal, honoring the past, evolving, collapse, divine feminine, love, and I'm going to add my own, which pertains to my presentation, which is rebirth. So these are kind of the words that I've collected from all these amazing speakers, and everyone's looking at shapeshifting in their own, from their own angle, and it's all so beautiful when it comes together. So I'm going to talk about shapeshifting from the perspective of a healer and with regards to energy medicine. I will briefly share my screen. So energy is what we are. We are frequency, and we are fluidic, and we are flowing. So based on this premise and this direct experience, shapeshifting is inherent to the practice of healing, of energy healing. Shapeshifting allows us to transmute and transform the actual consciousness structures that create our identity. And these consciousness structures exist in our fields, biographical fields, ancestral fields, and beyond. And as a healer, I feel them in my felt sense, in my being. I can actually feel their frequency. And allowing myself to feel also allows me to transmute. And we live in a world where there is so much fear of feeling. Particularly, one thing that Judith mentioned was emotional shape-shifting. We live in a world where there's so much global unrest and shock and trauma, it's hard to feel. So actually that prevents the inner alchemist that exists within all of us from actually being able to transmute itself. So alchemy, which is what I practice, healing alchemy, is a process of transmutation. And it's a process of transmuting denser frequencies into lighter frequencies through embodiment. So not through our imagination, but actually through our felt sense and integration. So we bring in these frequencies into our inherent sense of 0 point, which is in the crown or in the womb, and allows us to master our own inner energetics, and essentially allows us to transform our entire identity. And for those of you who might have known me maybe 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago, or even last year, will probably wonder who I am now, because I have grown and changed my entire identity so rapidly because I've been doing this process of constant collapse and rebirth. And now I offer that for people globally to experience directly the transmutation of their own field and the rebirth of their own identity. So when I talk about radical healing, that's what I mean. So shape-shifting is nature's metamorphosis. That's what was coming through my heart when I was writing this. usually shapeshifting, when it comes to energy medicine, is associated with shamanic practices, where a shaman will embody a landscape, a animal, a structure. And the goal is not to become the jaguar. The goal is to access the frequency that is just the right frequency to meet what you are trying to cure or heal. So when you do that and there's a meeting and there's a contact, what happens is that there's a 0 point and a dissolution. So the actual frequency of the structure dissolves and transmutes and becomes a different frequency. And therefore, that's how you can self-heal and heal others. And it's really amazing how nature's come through so strongly in today's presentations, nature, animal, and really the power of the human being. So I say every human being has an inner alchemist, and my mission is to help individuals, no matter where they are in their healing journey or in their consciousness journey, to start to believe that they have an inner alchemist. They have this voice of wisdom. They have this power to transmute endlessly frequency that they are getting stuck in. So we all know what it's like to get stuck, to stagnate, to feel like we're being held back, and to feel like we don't know how to get out of this particular realm we found ourselves in. It can be painful. When people exist in that frequency for too long or for long enough, and it's not healed, it gets projected and externalized into the world. And we can see that everywhere we look in the world. This is happening. And this is just a call for transmutation, for shape-shifting. So inner safety, and Tariq mentioned the word safety, and I felt it was so pertinent. I'm bringing it in here to do with a healing context. So inner safety and global security. I'm just making the link there because it is very, very obvious how human beings feeling safe enough within will allow for a better and deeper level of global safety, stability, and security. So I believe that this is available, and it starts within us as individuals. Well, so I have one more slide. So when it comes to the brain, really interestingly, when we look at how the brain processes information, it's actually still a mystery. But recently, neuroscientists have discovered that there might be evidence that the brain processes in up to 11 dimensions. Now, how is this relevant and useful? For those of you who've had experiences in alternative dimensions, altered states of consciousness, or who actively work with your inner energetics and your dimensional realms and your sense of identity in multidimensionality, you will know well that there are so many spaces that you can find yourself in, self as a vibrating frequency, and you can do so much healing work there. So the brain being able to process in 11 dimensions, and mainstream science starting to become aware of multidimensional processing capacities, is taking us that one step closer to being able to accept and appreciate different levels of intelligence, including energetic and spiritual intelligence. So how does going out there into those spaces actually help us to heal? Well, when we go beyond the mental, the physical, the emotional dimensions, which are very dense, which are where frequencies often manifest, where it's harder to actually create change. When we go beyond those fields into the fields that are more like abstract space, i.e. that are unmanifest, that are awaiting our arrival, when we access those fields with our consciousness and we feel there and we're still, what becomes clear and felt within the individual is the vast amount of space, potential, and stillness. And this is one thing that we need to be able to support people to access right now, because people are suffering because they don't have space to express themselves. They can't access stillness, so their nervous systems are becoming very active, hyperactive, and stressed, and it leads to chronic illness and disease. So being able to access dimensional spaces from within, which are still and spacious, i.e. peaceful, allows us to bring heaven on earth, allows us to bring in peace into our animal bodies. So this actually supports vagal tone, it supports our nervous system, our harmonization of our mind, of our entire fluidic body, and also of our brain. It supports our limbic system, which is our emotional processing center, to actually be able to reprocess fear, process emotional trauma that's been held, and allow us to recreate our memories. We all know what it's like to be haunted by memories, whether it's biographical or whether it's some kind of transpersonal imprint. And actually doing this kind of healing work will allow you to restructure the way that you perceive and experience your biographical domain, your memories. And I've experienced this firsthand, but I had to do it with plant medicines to be able to access the full consciousness within the memories that I believed I had. So memories are structures in time space. The more spacious you get, the more you're able to access of a particular memory, and therefore you get to see the whole picture. And often within trauma memories, what's missing is the purpose. Why? Why did it have to happen like that to me? And as long as you're asking why, you cannot be at peace inside. So the work I do is to support my clients to be able to access the purpose of pain and to work to find stillness within at a physical, emotional, and an energetic level, which brings me into if you'd like to experience shape-shifting firsthand, I have shape-shifted into many different forms in order to support and catalyze healing. So the most recent one was the elements, where I shape-shifted into the elements in order to bring in elemental healing through for my clients. And I work with groups and individuals. So in June, I have Cosmic Serpent. I will be shapeshifting into the frequency of the spirit of ayahuasca, which is often externalized as being something else, but is actually just a dimensional plane. So these are opportunities for you to experience, not theoretically, but directly, how you can shift your own consciousness structures and heal and experience a deeper stillness and change your entire identity. And it is possible. I'm going to end by just talking through a few quotes that people experience from my own clients who come into my programs and experience their own ability to shapeshift as a normal human being, shapeshifting in extraordinary ways. So some examples that ordinarily you might think, oh, only a shaman can do that. Well, actually, everybody can do this. I was flying as a golden eagle above the Amazon, rediscovering the rising phoenix of my father's lineage. Another one, I transformed into a fetus protected by the earth's core. If that doesn't change you at a fundamental level, knowing that earth is safe for you because you've had this inner experience, it will change you, and it does change people. Here we've got another example. I'm dumbfounded. I felt myself open up as big and wide as the Atlas Mountains, vast and so much space. So what I'm showing here through this slide is the common themes of shape-shifting, how it pertains to space, expression, transmutation of form. And there we have the final example. I feel no pain in my body. I'm full of trust, stillness, and space. All the emotions drained away, the void eclipsed. And I'm going to end on that note. Thank you, everyone.
Well, thank you all very much for your wonderful presentations. Thank you so much, Safa. This is amazing. I am very, very, very grateful for all the daily work you do and all the daily work that all the presenters do. So we are very honored and happy to have all of you here. And now I'm going to leave Jim Garrison to close this wonderful and magical session.
Matt, why don't you take over?
Yeah, there's a few things I wanted to say as well. So I'll just say a few words and then pass it over to Jim. So thank you so much to all of our panelists. This question of shape-shifting and identity can be approached from so many different angles. And we had quite a breadth of approach to this subject today. I think it painted a really interesting picture of how we can each embrace this approach to personal identity evolution with more consciousness and some interesting tools. So we would have liked to get more into the day-to-day. How can we take this beautiful knowledge and wisdom and really start integrating this into our life on a day-to-day basis? I would encourage everyone to attend the after chat today. I know a few of our panelists will be there to attend and dive into these subjects further. So again, Safa, Judith, Anika, Tarek, thank you so much for being here with us today. And this is a subject that I mentioned in the beginning that we'll be pursuing further during Ubiquity's summer programs and in the Next Gen Leadership Group on the UBverse. So thanks for being with us today, supporting the conversation, everyone. It was an honor to be here with you all. Over to you, Jim. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt, Raji, Veronica, for convening this panel, and Anika, Tariq, and Judith and Safa, thank you for your contributions. It's been very heartwarming for me to witness the courage with which all of you are approaching what you're doing. And Tariq, particularly for you there in Lebanon. I mean, what an amazing man you are, right in the middle of that cauldron, to be speaking your truth and your friends getting jailed and navigating through not only political turmoil, but legal obstacles and challenges. So I just want to salute what you're doing and to say that we stand with you in every way that we can, and hope to have you back on Humanity Rising in due course, as there's something new to report. And Anika, I was so struck by your presentation around men and how you view it and the possibilities for men. We're having a global men's summit this November, and would love to have you involved in some way, because we want to have a number of women like yourself as part of the summit to share their view about how we reimagine masculinity in a post-patriarchal world. And then Safa, I always admire anybody who can shapeshift beyond their humanness. And you seem to be able to do it like the best of the shamans. So well done. It's such an extraordinary gift. And it's what all of us need to be learning. I mean, you know, this interspecies communication is, and just being able to expand our identity, not only beyond male and femaleness into gender fluidity, but into other forms of species and other cosmic frequencies. So I really appreciated your bringing that to our attention. And then Judith, I always love it when anybody channels Joanna Macy, you know, one of the great treasures, really, of our time. So thank you for bringing that grace and that wisdom into our meeting today. So thank you, everyone. This has been splendid. Matt, Raji, Veronica, the way you, I don't know where you find all these people, but it's it's quite extraordinary. And we want to work all of you in as we proceed with Humanity Rising. And then tomorrow, everyone, we're going to turn to the issue of public health. And this is being convened by the Nordic Health 2030 movement. and the European Health Futures Forum. And they've done a series of panels on health. They're starting a new series, and this one is on health literacy. You know, all of us in the course of the pandemic have learned a lot more about viruses and pandemics and general health issues than we'd ever thought we would need to know. And so we're going to be focusing on the whole issue of enhancing our health literacy, because there's a lot of both information and misinformation going on out there about the pandemic, about the vaccines, that we need to be clear about. So that'll be our session tomorrow on Humanity Rising. You're all welcome to the after session chat group. The link is in the chat box there. And then finally, as Matt said, we're having a whole course this July on the intersectionality of gender, sexuality, race, and ethnicity, because this is a huge issue. And Matt is going to be putting together another next gen panel. So I hope several of you will be back for that course, and we welcome all of you to look at it. It's called Dialectica. It's the second of the liberal arts, which you can find on the Ubiquity University website. So thank you, everyone. We'll see you same time, same station on Humanity Rising tomorrow. Bye for now. Thank you, panel. Fabulous session.